Since 2009, Islamic Renaissance Front has been committed to creating alternative space for intellectual discourse about Islam, providing an inclusive space for Muslims and non-Muslims to engage in dialogues about Islam. We need a transformative space and time to think about Islam and our roles as Muslims and non-Muslims to bring good to our society and to humanity. To date, it is our honor to have a distinguished scholar from the United States, Professor Nada Hashimi, and a distinguished public intellectual from Malaysia, Dr. Zulkifli Ahmad, to be with us, to explore and debate the concepts and realities of democracy and secularism with an Islamic framework. Dr. Nada Hashimi is director of the Center for Middle East Studies, an associate professor of Middle East and Islamic politics at the University of Denver's Joseph Cobell School of International Studies. He is the author of Islam, Secularism, and Liberal Democracy, Toward a Democratic Theory for Muslim Societies. And he is the co-editor of The People Reloaded, The Green Movement and the Struggle for Iran's Future. As we know, there is no singular understanding of Islam. Since its conception in the 7th century through the Prophet Muhammad, Muslims as an individual or community had involved in making Islam comprehensible and livable to one's self and the society where he or she was located. Islam never could be understood and realized or actualized without the active agency of its believers. Today, I represent the Islamic Renaissance Front to welcome all of you, our very important guests, including the activists, academics, and professors, for your willingness to come together as a community to explore the modern concepts or terminology of democracy and secularism with an Islamic perspective. Given the fact that every one of us in this room is born, raised, educated, socialized, and politicized in a contemporary society which is centered upon a modern nation-state structure and form, perhaps it is a challenge as well as an invitation for both Muslims and non-Muslims to ask how we could think about Islam and democracy and secularism meaningfully within such socio-political setting. Is Islam and democracy compatible, even though Islam was first conceived in the 7th century? How secularism and secularity could be conceived in Islam or has been conceived by Muslim communities from the 7th century to recent modern societies? I wish to see every one of us in this room will take part actively, and together we want to make today's symposium a meaningful one. Our symposium today is a joint effort by the Islamic Renaissance Front and the Penang Institute. I would like to thank the Penang Institute for being a co-organizer. Both Islamic Renaissance Front and Penang Institute have collaborated on many events since the year of 2013. Our maiden event was held in Penang in January 2013, a colloquium on Islam and social justice. A few reminders. Please fill up the pre-symposium questionnaire, which has been put on your table. And there will be a post-symposium questionnaire to gauge whether there is any change in our ideas after attending the 2 seminars and a workshop. Another important reminder, there is a more informal round-table discussion at the Global Movement of Moderates on Sunday at 11 a.m. on Reconsidering Religion, the State and the Secular, with both Dr. Nada Hashimi and Dr. Zulkifli Ahmad again. For those who have not registered but interested to join, please to register and come to this roundtable discussion at Global Movement of Moderates in Bukit Damansara. Without further ado, I would like to invite our Honorable YB, Zairil Q. Johari, the Chief Executive Officer of the Penang Institute, to present his inaugural speech. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good morning. I wish to everyone here, especially our distinguished panel, my good friend Dr. Farouk, Dr. Zul, and of course our honored speaker today, Professor Nadir Hashimi from the University of Denver. So on behalf of the Penang Institute, we are of course very pleased to once again cooperate with the IRF. We have done many programs together, and we hope to continue this partnership, I think, for many more years to come. Yeah, we hope, inshallah. So today we're here to discuss some interesting topics. I will also deliver a short speech on the idea of secularism and Islam. I think these terms, when you talk about secularism, you talk about liberalism, they are not unfamiliar terms in our country. Although how Malaysians actually understand these terms is another matter altogether. But I would say, I think, if you were to compare, especially in the old days, the halcyon days of the past, post-Merdeka days, our founding fathers would be very quick and very proud to proclaim that, secularism and liberalism were their philosophical bedrock. So much so that the word liberal actually appears in our Rukun Negara. And to be secular and liberal in those days was to be forward-looking and constitutional. Well, of course, things have changed much since then. Today, the very same terms are used deleteriously as a mark of shame, almost as if it has become a scarlet letter for the Malay Muslim community. Today, to be secular and to be liberal is almost akin to being ungodly and aberrant. Take, for example, some remarks made at the 60th PAS Muktamar held in Batu Pahat, Johor last weekend. In his closing speech, the president of Malaysia's second largest Malay-based party, after UMNO, Datuk Sri Abdul Hadi Awang, took an unequivocal stand in differentiating his party's Islamic struggle from his coalition allies. So, and I quote, "PAS members must understand that there is a difference. PKR is based on pragmatic secularism, while DAP is based on socialistic secularism." That's my translation. Well, I think whether he realizes it or not, Tuan Guru Hadi's statement envisions actually a dichotomy between Islam and secularism, as if these are two disparate concepts that are not only different, but also antithetical to each other. In other words, one can either be Islamic or secular, but not both. Although our first three prime ministers would disagree with Hadi Awang's view, and actually the first and third prime minister have taken public stands to this effect. But the unfortunate reality is that such opinion, I think, actually now reverberates amongst the Malay Muslims in the country, including those that we may deem as the more urbane and educated middle class. And I think one only has to drive around. You look at some university campuses, community centers, even outside mosques, you see banners peppered with phrases such as the dangers of secularism, bahaya secularism, secularism, the main threat to the Muslim Ummah, or even Islam versus secularism. Meanwhile, the government-controlled media would continue to propagate this perception, with many columnists usually very quick to label those inclined towards secular and liberal ideals as Jewish or American agents. Invariably, these agents also turn out to be opposition politicians most of the time. And as we can see, no rational discussion can take place whenever these terms are invoked. And one example, I think we'll probably all remember, I think Dr. Farouk will remember very well, involves Nurul Izzah, my parliamentary colleague. I think in a forum some time back, she spoke on the issue of freedom of religion. And specifically, she mentioned that such rights had to be consistent between non-Muslims and Muslims. So in her mind, she was merely repeating a sacred commandment from the Quran itself, prohibiting compulsion in matters of faith. Yet the next thing she knew, there was a big ruckus, a furor, and she was accused of supporting apostasy amongst Muslims. And while one may expect such extreme reactions from hardline conservatives, the truth is that the apostasy issue actually gained so much traction, so much mainstream traction, that Nurul Izzah had to defend herself very rigorously. So from this episode, I think it is safe to conclude that while not every Malay Muslim thinks the way Utusan Malaysia editors do, the community continues to be haunted by these fears and insecurities. So perhaps one may ask at this point, why does an intrinsically human value, such as freedom, invoke so much fear amongst Malay Muslims in our country? Why is it that, Muslims here would go so far as to insult Islam by implying that the religion would not be able to survive if its followers were not bound to it by force of law? Are Malay Muslims so insecure in their own faith that they think mass apostasy would occur the instant they are given the freedom to do so? I would think that actually the origins of this fear in the Malay psyche can perhaps be traced back to the colonial experience. I think following the signing of the Pangkor Treaty in 1874 between the British and then Sultan of Perak, essentially meant that the Malay rulers began to lose their absolute power. And in fact, they were only left with authority over matters relating to Malay culture and religion. So fast forward today, the Malay rulers have been relegated even further to playing what is supposed to be a ceremonial role as a symbolic protector of Islam. However, this feudal relationship between the ruling class and the masses had to be maintained. Hence, the myth that Malay identity would be lost without a higher authority to protect it, to protect the cultural symbols. So this myth was perpetuated with the state instead assuming the role that the Malay rulers used to play as the defender of Malay Muslim culture. And this has since been constitutionally enshrined. So especially, you can see this trend picking up, especially in the 1970s, and well into Dr. Mahathir's era, where you see the state beginning to strengthen its monopoly over Islam by forming various Islamic institutions to protect or control the faith, such as the Islamic Dakwah and Training Institute, INDA, the Malaysia Islamic Economic Development Foundation, the Malaysian Dakwah Islamiyah Foundation, Institute of Islamic Understanding, to name a few. But I think the real culmination of this effort is the creation of JAKIM, the Department of Administration of Islamic Affairs. Despite the fact that Islam is supposed to be, according to the Constitution, devolved to the states, yet we see this very systematic centralization of power over Islam. And so as a result of this attempt to institutionalize the religion, Islam in Malaysia has become characterized by tight state control over its interpretation and administration. In other words, the state now dictates or tries to dictate every aspect of the Malay Muslim life, from what can or cannot be eaten, whether it's permissible to use Facebook, to practice yoga, or to dance the pocho-pocho, and even right down to what schools of thought can or cannot be practiced, as if God requires help from the Malaysian government. Thus, it's obvious that the conflation between Islam and the state has resulted in a state of dependency that has, if anything, reinforced these Malay Muslim insecurities. So I think, seen in this context, any ideology that encourages freedom of thought and conscience is therefore seen as a threat to the state's monopoly on Islam. Hence, I think that is why we see today the Islamic authorities' newfound obsession over the perils of secularism and liberalism. But the truth of the matter is actually quite ironic. Far from threatening Islam, I think a secular state based on democratic ideals would actually emancipate the religion from the vested interests of the state. This would in fact further the cause of Islamic thought and discourse. And we only need to look next door to see this happening. Indonesia is a good example. It is a majority Muslim country. In fact, it's over 80% Muslim, much more than us. And it is constitutionally secular. but at the same time culturally liberal. Yet there is no great fear. They are both secular and liberal, and they are unashamedly so. Yet there is no great fear among majority of the Muslims there that they are in danger of losing their faith. In fact, I think most people generally recognize that Islam in Indonesia is more diverse, is more vibrant, and in the absence of big brother ulama, more honest. And it was also the same case when you consider closer to home, Penang, the state where Dr. Farouk and I come from. In the late 19th and 20th century, Penang was actually the regional center for Islamic Islah, or Reformation, during a time when it was, for all intents and purposes, a truly secular state, with no mufti and no sultan to mind the people's religious affairs. And at the time, Penang housed many reformist Islamic journals, as well as many producers of Quran commentaries, or tafsir. And it is arguable that this would not have been the case in Penang had there been controls imposed upon religion. So it's actually during the British era where Penang actually became a great source of Islamic thought. And so I think it's clear that greater freedom poses no threat to Islam. If the Malaysian authorities fear the freedom that secularism and liberalism may entail, it is simply because they fear losing their ideological monopoly over the people and hence their political legitimacy. So to the contrary, I would suggest that secularism and liberalism are philosophical ideals that would strengthen and embolden Islam. And a truly Islamic society is one that is free in thought, free in conscience, where Islam is practiced honestly and where rituals are performed out of belief and not out of fear or pressure. So I think with that, I think these efforts that the Islamic Renaissance Front are doing in bringing distinguished speakers from overseas and talking about issues such as, these are hot button issues, secularism, liberalism, I know all bad words in Malaysia, but it's very important that we have discussions on these issues so that we understand and we are able to bring our thoughts and discourse further. And so the Penang Institute is, of course, very, very pleased to be part of this small effort. But, I think from the first time we started these forums until today, we see the crowd growing and growing. And that's a good sign. Today, now we have actually, I think, the biggest crowd we have seen so far. Which is good. I think we should continue this. And I hope, of course, all of you will continue to support this effort. So with that, I say thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.